Welcome to tonight's session of the university-wide course, Race in the United States, and thank you for joining us, those of you who are in the room, and those of you that are tuning in online via live stream. My name is Michelle DePaz, and I'm the Dean of the Milano School of International Affairs, Management, and Urban Policy here at the New School, Director of the Tishman Environment and Design Center, and the Tishman Professor for Environmental Policy and Management. Tonight's lecture is on Indigenous politics, history, and questions of race on Turtle Island. In a moment, I will introduce our distinguished lecturers for tonight. But beforehand, I wanted to give some context on why we are talking about Western colonialism in a class about race in the United States. It is critical to understand that white supremacy was used to justify Western colonialism. To understand race in the United States, much unlearning needs to take place. The history we are taught in public schools is the narrative of the colonizers, and the readings had us look at America's history as a colonialist settler state. The European colonizers expanded onto as much land as possible and established private property, depleted resources, and created an imbalance of trade, created economic dependency, and exerted state violence on indigenous peoples. Even when violence toward indigenous people is introduced to the narrative, it is still in the context of white America's manifest destiny, justifying the means by which they obtained this land. The modern takeover of reservation land and embezzlement of oil resources are a continuation of this nation's settler colonial founding. In resistance to colonialism, modern indigenous nations have been able to maintain their distinct culture and practices. Generations of indigenous leaders, activists, scholars, historians, writers, artists, musicians have kept traditions alive. It's no coincidence that we chose this week to focus on indigenous peoples. As many of us look forward to 2 days off from classes or work at the end of this week, it is essential that we acknowledge the false, sanitized version of American history that predicates the Thanksgiving holiday. Since 1970, the United American Indians of New England have instead gathered on Coles Hill in Plymouth, Massachusetts, to commemorate a national day of mourning. They gathered to honor Native ancestors and to protest the racism and oppression that underpin the genocide of Native peoples, the theft of their land, and an assault on their culture. But these are not just issues of the past. Precisely 1 year ago, water protectors at Standing Rock were targeted with water cannons in sub-freezing temperatures as they stood in peaceful protest to protect their sacred lands and drinking water from being destroyed by the Dakota Access Pipeline. Today, those same water protectors are being sued by Energy Transfer Partners, the corporation behind the pipeline, as eco-terrorists. Tonight, as we have throughout this course, we have an opportunity and a duty to face some ugly truths head on and to be explicit in calling out racism, discrimination, and injustice. Furthermore, we have to acknowledge the impacts of colonization, past and present. We've recommended for tonight 2 readings to provide a foundation for this class: The Introduction of Dunbar-Ortiz and Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, and The Red Nations from Charlottesville to Santa Fe, Smash Racist Memorials, Smash White Supremacy. The readings had us examine history from the perspective of indigenous peoples of this land who endured and continued to resist both brutal settler colonization and erasure. I've really been looking forward to this class because of our 2 incredible guests. Well, one is really a guest, and one we have the honor of being faculty here at the New School. They have done a great deal of work on decolonization and healing the collective trauma that is colonization. It is my honor now to introduce Jaskiran Dhillon and Melanie Yazzie. Melanie K. Yazzie is a Diné feminist with an unwavering commitment to defending and liberating Native people from the violence of colonialism. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of California, Riverside. She holds a PhD in American Studies from the University of New Mexico. She specializes in Diné studies, Indigenous feminist and queer studies, American Indian history, social and political theory, violence, political ecology, and social movements. She is a past vice president of Navajo Studies Conference, Inc., a nonprofit dedicated to development of Navajo studies, and an organizer with the Red Nation, a revolutionary movement advocating the liberation of Native people from colonialism and capitalism. She has published articles and book reviews in Wakazo Sa Review, Studies in American Indian Literature, American Indian Quarterly, Social Text, and American Quarterly. Her first book project is based on her dissertation. It offers a critical feminist and materialist history of post-war Navajo political formations. Welcome, Melanie. Jaskiran Dhillon is a first-generation academic and organizer who grew up on Treaty 6 Cree and Métis territory in Saskatchewan, Canada. Committed to the tenets of public intellectualism, Jaskiran's scholarship is intimately connected to and informed by on-the-ground advocacy and direct action. Her work spans the field of settler colonialism, anthropology of the state, anti-racist and indigenous feminism, youth studies, colonial violence, and indigenous studies, and has been published in The Guardian, Cultural Anthropology, Truth Out, Public Seminar, Feminist Formations, and Decolonization, among other venues. Her first book, Prairie Rising, Indigenous Youth, Decolonization, and the Politics of Intervention, provides a critical ethnographic account of state interventions in the lives of urban Indigenous youth. Her new research focuses on developing an anti-colonial critique of the environmental justice movement by examining Indigenous political movements working against the extractive industry, including the resistance at Standing Rock. Welcome, Professors Jaskiran Dhillon and Professors Melanie K. Yazzie.
So welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. I just want to say thank you to Michelle DePaz and Maya Wiley and Derek Hamilton for organizing this semester-long class on race, and we're really excited to be here and offer some insight around Indigenous politics and history and why we believe it should be an important part of the conversation. I'd also like to thank my friend and comrade Melanie for coming out from California and making time for us. She's in very high demand, has a very busy schedule, so we're super fortunate to have her here tonight. And I see some of my students, so thanks for coming out too and being part of this event.
If it's okay, I just want to introduce myself really quickly in my language. So Melanie Yazzie is actually the Navajo word for my last name. Melanie Yazzie Yinisha Bilagana Nishlem Adesh Kishni Bashish Chin Bilagana Dasha Chero Totsoni Dasha Nale Behauge the White Cone, Arizona de Nasha Kotao Astadanenishle. So I just identified myself by my clans. That's how we identify ourselves to our relatives as Diné or Navajo people, and this is who I am as a Navajo woman. My family is from the White Cone chapter, the White Cone area on top of the mesa on the west side of the highway in White Cone, Arizona, for the Diné people who are in this room and also watching the live stream, so that's how I identify myself in relationship to you. And I'd like to really thank the New School. I'd like to thank Michelle and Jas for extending the invitation to be here to give this presentation and this lecture on really work that's really dear to my heart, and also the survival and the future of my own people. So yeah, thank you.
So we're going to spend the next sort of 45 minutes or so walking you through some of the history and politics that we think is central for thinking through Indigenous politics and history within the context of a conversation about race. And then we're going to open up a dialogue with Michelle and invite her to come up and be part of this conversation with us, and then leave some time for Q&A at the end.
Great, so I'm going to get started. So let me push the slide forward.
If you can use the arrows too.
Let's do that. Did that work? Okay. So we're asking, thanks. So the question that we wanted to start out with is, why focus on Indigenous politics and history in a class or a course that's about race in the US? So importantly, and I think Michelle alluded to this in her introductory remarks, oftentimes when we think about race or racism in the United States, we think about white supremacy, right? And necessarily so. Of course, our current historical context in the era of Trump, white supremacy has re-entered a certain kind of political and historical conversation, particularly on the American left. Not that it ever went out of that, but it's now back in the public sphere, I think, in new, disturbing, but also I think ways that are bringing different mobilizations and movements together. Something that a lot of people don't think about, though, is how white supremacy is premised not just on anti-Black racism, which is very important, right? That's a foundational pillar of US nationalism, but that white supremacy is also energized and animated by settler colonialism, which Dunbar-Ortiz shows us is all about indigenous genocide. So I wanted to show you this. This is a visual representation. This was made by a Dene youth who works for an anarchist info shop in the Navajo Nation. And this was in response to the murder of a comrade in Charlottesville. If you guys remember what happened in August, we had a solidarity rally with some of our comrades in a small reservation border town in New Mexico called Gallup. And so she made this, and the moccasin is it mimics the traditional Navajo footwear that we have. Of course, that's a Nazi symbol, and we called it bullshit, of course. And we're smashing white supremacy and the representation of white supremacy through the symbol, the Nazism symbol. And so this representation shows that indigenous people have just as much at stake in smashing white supremacy as other folks, especially racialized populations in the United States.
So just quickly to add to that, just to be clear, this is not a supplanting of the movement for Black lives or the pushback against the rampant anti-Black police violence that is so prevalent throughout America. This is a way of thinking about how settler colonialism enters into the conversation about race and violence and colonialism within the context of US history. And this also means that we need to understand how racism, heteropatriarchy, and capitalism operate from an intersectional framework, right? So this is about how these things work together to produce the sense of US nationalism and sort of dominant trope around US nationalism that is so prevalent in the way people think and talk about the founding of the United States.
So I moved us on forward in the slide a little bit early, so I apologize. So we want to get directly into the readings because we actually don't have a lot of time. The time goes by quickly. So we wanted to open up really quickly with who is Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. Roxanne's a dear friend and a mentor of mine, but Roxanne is a stridently anti-colonial US historian. And so in the chapter that we read for tonight, she's really challenging the way that US history has been written from a settler perspective that naturalizes the narrative of manifest destiny and how that informs what we even understand as history or what we even understand as society and the organization of life in the United States. And so she's always written anti-colonial and actually anti-capitalist histories. And she's been involved for over 50 years actually in indigenous liberation movements in Turtle Island, but also in Central America. So that's who she is, and that's how she positions herself in relationship to the work.
Yeah, and so this is sort of a quote from the beginning part of the text, and we chose Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, as Melanie mentioned, as a foundational text for this class because of her relationship to the discipline of history and the kind of counter-narratives and critiques, anti-colonial critiques, that she provides of history, which are, prevalent within institutions of higher education. So in this quote, she says, "To say that the United States is a colonist settler state is not to make an accusation, but rather to face historical reality, without which consideration not much in US history makes sense, unless indigenous peoples are erased. But indigenous nations, through resistance, have survived and bear witness to this history."
And so she goes on to ask, she asks it earlier on in the piece, but one of the most important questions we think that she poses, and it's really the impetus behind writing the book in the first place, is how might acknowledging the reality of US history work to transform society? And we'll close with this as well. But this reality that she's talking about, and of course that she uncovers in the introduction, is this reality of genocide, with indigenous people being the primary survivors also, but targets of this genocide, and that the history of the United States is a history of settler colonialism and genocide, right? And so this is the intervention that she's making into the naturalization of manifest destiny in mainstream US history and historiography. Sure, I'll read this quotation. The history of the United States is a history of settler colonialism, as I've just said. The founding of a state based on the ideology of white supremacy, the widespread practice of African slavery, and a policy of genocide and land theft. One of the reasons why we wanted to highlight this particular quotation from the text is because it also demonstrates sort of this intersectionality of different structures of power, right, that work together to buttress really manifest destiny and this narrative that the United States tells itself, right, about itself is sort of a natural bearing of goods for the citizenry of the United States. And so she makes it really explicit in the book. So what is manifest destiny?
So manifest destiny is ideology, a belief, a mythology that is interwoven with the practice of settler colonialism. So what are the value systems that guide how people think about occupation and conquest and settlement? What are the ways that they come to rationalize and reconcile processes of elimination and violence that are necessary for things like settler colonialism to take place? And we'll talk about what settler colonialism is in a second, but first we want to foreground this idea of manifest destiny.
Right, and so as we have here on our second bullet point, settler colonialism is rooted in this mythology of manifest destiny. And she goes to pretty great lengths in this particular chapter to tell us, to give us the different dynamics, the different dimensions of what manifest destiny is. And one of the first and primary ways that manifest destiny is defined by Ortiz is this inevitability of US extent and power. This notion that the United States has always existed, right? This word I use of naturalization, that it has a rightful claim to the space and the lands that now comprise the territory that is the United States of America. And that manifest destiny creates this sort of consciousness within the citizenry and even within those of us who practice intellectual projects like historians who write history. We presume that there's a givenness to the United States, that we shouldn't challenge or even think about how the United States came into existence in a critical way.
Yeah, and sort of coupled with this was the idea that obviously it was supposed to stretch from coast to coast. And so this ongoing encroachment and territorial expansion that is part of the imaginary of what settlement is in the creation of a settler state like the United States. And then the last piece that we sort of want to touch on briefly, and since we don't have enough time to obviously delve into all of this because this is a very short lecture, condensed lecture, but we really encourage you to read her chapter on the doctrine of discovery, which of course is the international legal doctrine that provides the justification for European colonization, sort of linked to this idea of terra nullius, the idea that this is empty land that can be conquered, that can be claimed by European colonizers. And so this is sort of, again, the international legal doctrine that helps to feed the ideology of manifest destiny and the entire set of practices that emerge from it.
Okay, so we're going to move on and we're going to define what settler colonialism is. Some of you may have heard this term before. But it's a specific framework that I think even 10 years ago, if Roxanne were writing this book, she actually wouldn't have been able to use it because there's been a really robust kind of explosion of intellectual and political work specifically around settler colonialism and what that means and why it's important to the writing and thinking about US history. And it's primarily as a historical project, as a political project about rethinking this narrative of consent that we're all in a consensual relationship with the United States, this narrative of the US as a narrative of settler colonialism and thinking about it instead as that. And so it's about challenging this origin story, kind of the fantasy of manifest destiny based on these notions of freedom and liberty, spreading democracy throughout the world, the term American exceptionalism refers to when we think about the history of the United States. And so there are a few points about what settler colonialism is.
Yeah, so I think it's important within this framing to just underscore that we frame the United States and understand it as a settler colony, right? So when you operate from that perspective and vantage point, the whole history and quote unquote colonial founding of the United States comes into question. And we operate, and we're thinking through this framework, we're operating from the basis that there was an intent to eliminate Indigenous people in order to access the land, right? Territory is necessary in order to build a new society on top of a pre-existing set of societies, and this is the basis of conquest and occupation. So this is, again, as Melanie said, so this is sort of a pushback against this consensual narrative that everybody arrived here and found a way to live together in harmony, and it was sort of a peaceful sharing of the land. This is a sort of restoring of that consensual narrative through the lens of violence, conquest, and occupation.
And an important element that Dunbar-Ortiz points out, an important dimension of settler colonialism is genocide. And she actually goes into length in other parts in the book describing what is genocide. And genocide, I think often when we think about that, we think of genocide as sort of outright killing, outright massacre, but in fact it encompasses a variety of practices, a variety of particularly colonial practices. And so she's very clear that we understand, and we understand the history and Indigenous people's history of the United States as a history of genocide. And the quotation that we drew from the book about this is that settler colonialism is a genocidal policy. The objective of US colonialist authorities was to terminate their existence as peoples, not as random individuals. So as Jas pointed out, genocide and settler colonialism that uses genocide as one of its primary technologies of control and of governance is explicitly about the elimination of Indigenous peoples as collectivities, as nations, as polities, and then also the destruction of sort of their governing and their political authority and their prior claims to land and territory, which is of course what the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius also kind of normalizes in our minds, that somehow Indigenous people were never here. There was nobody here before the United States existed. And this also works with these other kind of legal and national imaginaries to constantly erase Indigenous claims, particularly legal and political claims to the land.
Yeah, and alongside that is obviously a supplanting of Indigenous ways of being and living and governance with colonial state institutions, right? So you have the invention of colonial law, you have the creation of education systems, child welfare systems that are all part of colonial state structures to ensure the development of white settler society and to ensure settler sovereignty. So it's also about rereading and rethinking the way that our social institutions function in relationship to contemporary conditions of Indigenous existence and life and politics and history. And sorry, just to flip back 1 second. And then to also think about the kinds of ideologies that feed into this, right? So racial hierarchies, notions of savagery and civilization that are part of the ways in which these institutions take hold and part of the ways in which settler state power and settlement actually happens in material ways, which leads to the next.
Yeah, sorry. The reason why I switched the slide forward was because Dr. Dhillon was actually starting to articulate, right, if there are multiple ways in which genocide works, they work in all of these ways, right? It's not always just about outright massacre. It's not always something that happens when we think sort of conventionally about wartime. Settler colonialism is an everyday practice of the state. Citizens participate in settler colonialism, right? And if settler colonialism by design is a policy of genociding Indigenous people, it happens in multiple ways. It has multiple technologies and multiple dimensions. And so a perspective that understands US history as a history of settler colonialism necessarily requires us, as Dr. Dhillon states, to rethink how the state functions. And what Dunbar-Ortiz points out in this particular chapter in the book is that we have to understand that settler colonialism fundamentally absolutely requires violence, because genocide is violence, right? And so it happens in all of these multiple ways: torture, policing and terror, colonial gender violence, massacring, systemic military occupations, the theft of children, which happened in the United States primarily through boarding schools, in Canada through residential schools, and massive forms of criminalization and carcerality.
Yeah, and I also think I love this part of her reference, and I think there's other people that write about this way, the violence in this way too, is that people do not give over their land, resources, or children and futures without a fight, and that fight is often met with violence. So I think also to just underscore everything that's been said so far, this is a contemporary story of violence. This is not a story of violence that just exists in the past. This is also a contemporary story of ongoing colonial violence, and Michelle pointed to some of this when she was speaking about Standing Rock at the beginning too, right? So we see the kind of large-scale, militarized response to Indigenous resistance that emerged at Standing Rock, which is partly a response to claims about territory, to claims about political sovereignty, to claims about history, to claims about treaties, right, which are all part of the way that Indigenous peoples have always resisted and to continue to resist ongoing kinds of colonial violence. And I think why I was so excited partly to have Melanie here was because, and you can call me Jess.
Okay.
Part of the reason why I was so happy to have Melanie here and her partner Nick, who's actually also here in the audience, is that they do incredible work with young people, with Native youth, around contemporary conditions of colonial violence. So in addition to doing all of the incredible scholarship that they do, they also are on the ground doing the hard material work of dealing with ongoing colonial violence in the everyday lives of the young people that they mentor, that they support, that they're turning into basically and supporting to be the next set of revolutionary leaders to chart a different life for themselves and their communities.
Thank you, Jas. One more thing I'd like to point out before we move on. Something that Dunbar-Ortiz doesn't necessarily say in this, but what's really important is that understanding the history of the United States as a history of settler colonialism, as a history of genocide against Indigenous peoples, makes us not think about colonialism as a period of history that happened in the past, which is really how U.S. historiography views and writes about the explicit word colonialism, but rather what understanding U.S. history from a perspective of settler colonialism does is it helps us understand why the state responds in the present to Indigenous people like they did at the No DAPL Frontlines and Standing Rock, the way that it did, right? So we understand that settler colonialism, like anti-Black racism, is a structure of power that is always present as long as the United States, frankly, continues to exist. And the imaginary of U.S. nationalism continues to be sort of propagated as sort of this origin story of how we came to be in this place together.
Yeah, and it's often really shocking to me that the egregious violence that exists against Indigenous peoples, for example, in the area of police brutality, is completely negated in the mainstream media and reporting on police brutality in the United States. You almost never see stories yet. There's story after story of Indigenous people being shot by the police that will never make it into mainstream accounts of police brutality.
So I think we've maybe touched on this a bit already, so we can breeze through this. But I hope we've, even though we're going very fast through this massive history and quite dense theoretical material, but that the question of land and Dunbar-Ortiz, actually I think in about the third sentence in the introduction to the book, tells us that this is a story about land, that the story of the United States is a story about territorial seizure, about acquisition through elimination, about unleashing the full violence of the state against Indigenous people when in places like Standing Rock in 2016 and 2017 are exerting political claim and authority really over land, because a great deal of what that struggle was about treaty rights, right? And treaty rights, the treaty that was being enacted and sort of struggled over during the No DAPL struggle covered a much larger land base than the actual Oceti Sakowin, or the Great Sioux Nation, is allowed to have right now, being broken up into these tiny reservations. And so the reservation system, again, sort of naturalizing the geography of the United States and just thinking about reservations as the only places where Indigenous people exist, completely ignores and erases, right? The fact that this land did not belong to the United States at one point in history, that it had to be seized through a number of incredibly violent tactics to displace and to erase the peoples who were already here and had multiple different relationships and practices with those lands. And so land is always fundamental, even if it's forgotten, I think in a lot of ways. Land had to be privatized through certain forms of capitalist possession, right? And through certain forms of patriarchal possession in relationship to land ownership and other kinds of ownership. And so land is always at the center of this story of US nationalism and what it tells itself.
Yeah, and I think you see the sort of translation of land to property as commodity, especially in cities that are never read as Indigenous territories, right? So this idea that only Indigenous people live on reserves, even though more Indigenous people live in urban centers, the way we think about New York City as a city of natives, but we don't think of New York City as Lenape territory, right, is part of the way that this reinscription of land as property and ownership, or what Eileen Morton Robinson calls like the white possessive logics around property, is so prevalent, is part of the way that we just think about the spaces that we occupy and move in.
And so New York City is Indigenous land. It doesn't just have Indigenous bodies in the population of the city. This is Indigenous land, and New York City goes several stories deep into this land. And so thinking about the history of settler colonialism and colonial violence in this space is something we'd like you to think about coming out of this space tonight. All right. Do you want me to do it? Okay, so something that Dunbar-Ortiz spends a lot of time on kind of towards the end of this chapter is a critique of multiculturalism. And the way that she frames this, right, is she does a critique of the different moves that historians have made, particularly in the 20th and the 21st century, to talk about US history, and the way that pretty much all of these moves continue to erase Indigenous peoples and constantly reenact kind of the spirit and the manifest, or the spirit and the narrative of Manifest Destiny. And one of the things that does this rather cunningly is multiculturalism, because I think a lot of people think about multiculturalism as a good thing, especially this logic of diversity that institutions like to traffic in. And so for her, and then she does a really great breakdown of this, how multiculturalism functions in the way that historians write US history is that it's premised on a politics of inclusion. And this politics of inclusion is really about transforming, again, right, this collective political, this Indigenous collective political claim, a prior claim to land that precedes the United States, and moving Indigenous peoples into these sort of inchoate ethnic and racial groups that can then be managed in different ways and controlled in different ways by the colonial state.
Right, so then Indigenous people become a race, an ethnic group in a sea of other ethnic groups. So their territorial claims to land, their histories to place, their experiences of violence, contemporary and past and future and present, are all erased within this framing of this collapse into this multiculturalist trope. So this sort of negates their distinct experiences to relationships and their relationships to land and life, and it celebrates difference, right? It's all about individual communities, ethnic communities that become marked as celebrating difference and demonstrating their contributions to the United States as an entity, right? As a sovereign entity. How do you demonstrate your worth to the United States of America through a celebration of your difference and the contributions that your people, your racial or ethnic group have made? So this really troubles how Indigenous people become raced, like categorized as a racial group, as an ethnic group that can fit within this conventional sort of framing of everybody's here together contributing to an American society.
And her critique of multiculturalism, I think, moves us to a really productive place about the tensions between thinking about Indigenous peoples only through the lens of race, right? Because race means a lot of things, and it's defined by different political orientations and intellectual traditions as different things. But within the multicultural framework, racing Indigenous people erases their indigeneity and their claim that erases the history of settler colonialism as well as the actual political and legal relationship that they have to territory, right? And so this is an important aspect of kind of troubling the relationship between race and Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, and just in this last point up here, sort of just following off exactly what Melanie said, is that sovereignty and treaties and Indigenous nationhood remain largely unquestioned within the multiculturalist discourse, right? These are not conversations about land and treaties and territory. They're conversations about culture and conversations often about cultural performance and contribution, as opposed to conversations about land.
And so she has this really beautiful, powerful quotation, and I'm going to read it, that really sums up this particular slide in this section. But this idea of the gift-giving Indian, right, proving your worth to the US state, helping to establish and enrich the development of the United States, is an insidious smokescreen meant to obscure the fact that the very existence of the country is a result of the looting of an entire continent and its resources. With multiculturalism, Manifest Destiny won the day. Cool, I'll talk about this a bit more. So something else that Dunbar-Ortiz touches on throughout, doesn't quite concentrate on, but touches on, is this: if we understand the history of the United States as a history of settler colonialism, as a history of genocide, perpetrated against Indigenous peoples, then our understanding of what resistance means, how Indigenous people interact with the state, also changes. And we understand Indigenous resistance as a survival technique, right? You can't, if we understand that settler colonialism and the United States perpetrates genocidal violence against Indigenous people, and Indigenous people like my own people simply refuse to be exterminated, then we engage in practices of resistance, right? We resist our annihilation. And so this is how she frames Indigenous resistance. It's how I frame Indigenous resistance too. It's a very alive, dynamic, sort of multifaceted project of survival, everyday life, but also really strong, strident political organizing of the kind that we do in the Red Nation. And so the second reading we had you guys do, I actually co-authored it with the Red Nation, the Indigenous Liberation Organization I organize with. And one of the primary things that we do in the Red Nation when we write these things, we do a lot of public intellectual work. We write, we do public lectures, we do a lot of political education in public, we write op-eds, we do essays, we publish things, we go into spaces, we go into communities, and we talk about settler colonialism, and we do a lot of education. And the reason why we do that is because we're practicing what Dunbar-Ortiz is actually practicing. We're trying to restory this history. We're trying to help and uncover the truth of this history. And part of what Dunbar-Ortiz wants to do, because she's not just a historian and an academic, she's also a revolutionary, right, is bridging the gap between our intellectual practice and our political commitments, and then how we engage in sort of action towards social transformation. I would say it more stridently as a revolutionary decolonization movement that will actually abolish the United States, which is our goal as a Red Nation. And so when we rewrite history, we are also engaging in sort of a radical form of revolutionary decolonization, and they go hand in hand. Go ahead, Jas.
Oh, no, I just wanted to say, I think what often becomes misunderstood or misrecognized within Native movements for liberation is that this is a politics of inclusion. This is not a politics of inclusion. This is a politics of accountability. This is a politics of accountability of what it means to live on Indigenous territory that has been seized and occupied through egregious levels of violence, again, past, present, and likely into the future, unless we can find ways to sort of engage in the politics, revolutionary kind of politics that Melanie and her comrades at the Red Nation are engaging in. And I do think that there is a sort of deliberate, an intentional move to collapse the spaces between academic institutions like this one and the frontline organizing and political work that is being done. And Melanie just began to chart some of the sort of broad-reaching political work that the Red Nation does, and that she does in addition to being sort of a full-time professor at her home institution.
So the second, just to talk a bit more about that second piece. So what we're talking about in that piece, the Smash Racist Memorials, Smash White Supremacies, was actually a campaign that is still ongoing in Santa Fe, New Mexico. We started in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and even though we're growing nationally, we do a great deal of regional work in the American Southwest, where there's a massive Indigenous population everywhere all the time. It's fabulous. I miss it. And so this particular campaign was to abolish a racist celebration of conquest and genocide called the Entrada that happens in Santa Fe every year. And do we want that to be abolished? Yes, just like people are toppling racist memorials and statues, right? This is something that's been happening, especially in the spotlight following Charlottesville for the past few months here in the United States. We also want to topple these kinds of holidays and celebrations. We had a campaign against Columbus Day, and we won Indigenous Peoples Day in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and it's actually a movement that spread like wildfire throughout Turtle Island. And these campaigns are definitely meant to be won. We wish to win. We wish to replace these holidays and these memorials. We wish for them to be abolished. But these are also vehicles for telling history, right? These are also vehicles for rewriting, R-I-G-H-T-I-N-G, rewriting history and telling an Indigenous people's history of Santa Fe, or telling an Indigenous people's history of New Mexico. And so they serve a dual function. They're both pedagogical, but they're also deeply political, and they change the material terrain of power and struggle in these locations where we engage in these particular campaigns. So, go ahead. Yeah. So what Jas was talking about, this isn't a politics of exclusion. Right, the Indigenous people have an exceptional relationship with the land and with the United States, in the sense that we were here prior, right? We were here prior to the founding of the United States. And settler colonialism targets and racializes us in very specific ways because of that, because we have prior, not just ontologies, but political and legal relationships with the territory that is now the United States. This being the case, when we do movement work, because I'm an organizer, I'm not just an intellectual, we're really dedicated to coalition building, to working across difference. We're not really interested in just having this sort of like exclusive Indigenous liberation project where only Indigenous people can be doing the work, right? And so when the airport protests erupted, if you guys remember, in late January, after the Muslim ban came down from the White House, there was a whole lot of manifest destiny going on. Those airport protests. This land is your land. This land was made for you and me. We're a nation of immigrants. A lot of this stuff was being sung and said at the airport protests and participating in the narrative of manifest destiny that erases, right, the history of settler colonialism. And so my partner and I went to the LAX protest and staged an intervention with no ban on stolen land, which then went viral as a hashtag. And so the no ban on stolen land reminds people, right, that there's a history of conquest and colonialism, that even whilst we're engaging in immigrant rights work in the United States, we must also be attentive intersectionally, right, to the ongoing reality of settler colonialism. But it was a double move. It wasn't just a critique and an intervention in the manifest destiny that was happening, in the imaginary of belonging that was being portrayed by people who were protesting at these airports in January, but it was also a reimagining of how we relate to each other. And so it's about, if Indigenous people are still here, we still have ongoing political and legal and philosophical understandings of belonging and of responsibility, of making kin, of relating to other people who are guests in our territory, then why not enact that with people in a spirit of radical solidarity and radical welcoming? We actually did a welcoming ceremony at LAX with our Muslim relatives, and everybody was crying. I mean, it was actually beautiful and powerful. And that is actually the power when we understand that Indigenous people are still here. We still very much have a strong relationship with the land, and we've never given up, absolutely never given up our legal and our political traditions of belonging and citizenship, and that these aren't just about us being Indigenous people, and they're not race-based, but in fact they can include everybody, but the values that drive those philosophies and practices of belonging are completely different than sort of the colonial relation, what the colonial relation expects us to do. And so that's what No Ban on Stolen Land envisioned and tried to practice.
And I also, just quickly to add to that, there was also amazing organizing efforts from Black Lives Matter, or the movement from Black Lives at Standing Rock. Nick and Melanie and I, encountered numerous people that had come from Ferguson, Toronto, that were there doing the same kind of solidarity work, that were thinking across lines of exploitation, of violence. And it was really powerful to hear them articulate their response to why they were at Standing Rock, why they'd come from Ferguson to Standing Rock, how they thought about the violence as co-constitutive, how it's actually co-constitutive, right, in the way that it plays out in the contemporary moment. So in addition to No Ban on Stolen Land, that was also a really clear example of the power of that coalition building and what happens when you think about these histories in relationship to one another, as opposed to separating them into silos and thinking about them as like distinct.
And also about thinking of them as sort of these competing lines or forms of oppression. Yeah. And then, as my partner says, when we play the oppression Olympics, everybody loses, right? And so when we say in the Red Nation that we're really committed to coalition as a method of organizing for liberation and revolution, we actually mean it, right? Working across difference, understanding how, if we understand that power works intersectionally, if we understand that settler colonialism can't do the work that it does without heteropatriarchy can't do the work that it does without anti-Blackness, right? And that these can't do their work without imperialism and capitalism, then we start to understand the things we have in common, right? But that we're accountable to all of these structures of power at the same time, and we don't erase each other in the work that we're doing when we're trying to build serious movements. And so this is one of the sort of guiding philosophies of the Red Nation. I think we're out of time, actually.
No, we have 5 minutes.
We do, awesome.
15?
We have 15 minutes. Oh, we move so
I
fast.
have 10 minutes.
Okay. So I'm just going to go to the website really quickly so you can see. Oh, you can't see it. How do we do that? Well, let me just talk about this real quickly, maybe figure it out. So the reason why I am an organizer, so I'm going to talk about what we do, because I'm always organizing. I'm presenting about history, but I want people to get involved in organizing. I want people to get involved in movement work, because now more than ever, we really need each other. Right? I've been having lots of conversations with people who are really devastated by our current condition, who are tired because they've been doing movement work for a long time. And something that I was taught, actually primarily by Black feminists and revolutionaries who work in the tradition of the Black radical tradition, is that if you call yourself a revolutionary, then you cannot be a pessimist. You are not allowed to be that person. Because how do we dream? How do we have freedom dreams? How do we dream of decolonization? How do we make those things a reality unless we're committed to the actual movement and we actually believe in the capacity of our people to liberate ourselves, right? And so this is something that also guides the Red Nation, and it's why I always organize and do my work. You guys are welcome to come to this website and check out whatever. But this right here, just scrolling through, it describes all of the different things that we do. We do a lot of work on police violence against Native people. We support Indigenous youth. All of our movements and all of our campaigns are led by Indigenous youth. We're always trying, again, to do intersectional and sort of cross-movement work. We do stuff that's really site-specific, so what Pueblo people face and the dynamics of colonialism that they're combating in their movements aren't necessarily the same as what Lakota people are doing at Standing Rock. They're not necessarily the same as what my people, the Dene, are struggling against. The way that colonialism manifests is different, slightly different in those contexts. And so we try to develop sort of a pan-tribal or a pan-indigenous approach to the movement without losing a grounding in the complexities of the actual materialities of what struggle looks like in each location. So we're an international movement, but at the same time, the chapters and the networks of people that we work with are really grounded in the material conditions of oppression where they are. Do you want to say anything?
Oh, I'll let you keep going.
We do work on Palestine. I've increasingly started to do work on the Irish liberation struggle, right? And so we also work in a lot of socialist and communist traditions in the Red Nation as well. We have a lot of radical traditions that inform what we do, how we interact with people, and how we articulate our politics. And so I understand the Palestinian liberation struggle and the Irish liberation struggle to be struggles, national liberation struggles that are also anti-colonial and aspire to decolonize their nationalities and their oppressed peoples from persistent colonialism, even settler colonialism in the locations where they're at. And so it makes a lot of sense for Indigenous people who have actually always had relationships internationally with other colonized populations to continue to forge these relationships, to continue to support each other's struggles internationally, and then to develop our analytics and our politics from an internationalist framework in a way that a lot of Indigenous people actually cited in the United States don't always actually think about themselves. So that's some of the work we do. We do work on political prisoners and other forms of incarceration. And we're stridently feminist in our politics as well. So part of what we do also is we do restorative justice when there are issues with sexual perpetrators, right, which is also something in the Harvey Weinstein era of movement building in the United States. It's really important to tackle those things in our movements, to call out perps when they're operating amidst us and in our spaces. And so we've had to develop an entire Indigenous feminist framework about handling that interpersonally and politically. And people come to us sometimes to help them with those issues in other parts of the movement. And so what I'm trying to paint is a picture of like the number of things that we do, but to always reinforce treating each other as good comrades, to be accountable. It's really when it comes down to it, being accountable to each other, being accountable to our dreams of liberation, the future of our people, the beauty and aspirations of our people. It's really just about accountability.
Yeah, and I think what struck me so much in listening to Melanie and Nick and some of their comrades is the kind of high work and attention they put into building relationships. Relationality sits at the center of so much of what they do. So it's conversations with people, it's meeting people, it's holding reading groups with youth, it's having conversations and discussions with, which in a world of like very fast moving technology doesn't always happen, but I think is required to build the kind of sort of cross-coalition, deep, long-term commitment to understanding like specificity of local struggle, but at the same time commitment to a larger political project. It requires that kind of attention to relationships, to long-term relationships, and to really doing the work of developing those kinds of connections with one another to be able to build across lines. And I've been really encouraged to see some of this even happening within my own classes. Like Hunter is here, for example, from my Indigenous Politics and Settler Colonialism class. And there have been conversations that we've been having now about, in the context of trying to understand the way the Algonquins of Barrier Lake, for example, are being positioned as Aboriginal extremists, Black protesters and organizers working against anti-Black violence are also being tagged by the FBI as Black extremists, right? So this kind of work of thinking about these things in relationship to one another and then doing the work of relationship building is so key to how you develop this arsenal of resistance, this sort of multi-pronged political strategy to thinking about revolutionary change that for me is incredibly inspiring and also very hopeful.
Thanks, Jess. So we want to return. Yeah. This is my version of Roxanne's question we kind of started out with. I think she used the language of social transformation. I would be more strident and direct, and I would call it a revolutionary movement for decolonization. And so when we're talking about, we're ending here, right, with the politics of accountability. In the spirit of Roxanne herself, you can't rewrite history without also doing something about it. Because that's who she is in life, and that's how she's mentored me and other people in the Red Nation. So how might centering the reality of US history, a reality of genocide, a reality of settler colonialism, how might that produce a revolutionary movement for decolonization, right? And so we're thinking it's not just about liberation, it's about liberation from colonialism, and that's what decolonization describes. Historically, that's what it's described. Politically, that's what it's described. And this is something that we're always moving towards in the Red Nation. And if you want to add anything.
No, and I think this just, again, encourages a kind of confrontation with one's own complicity in reproducing colonial relations of domination in all the kinds of interpersonal and institutional spaces we move in, right? So we ask ourselves these hard questions about how we're implicated in these colonial relations of domination through the ways that we participate in institutions, how we go about doing political organizing, the things that we choose to privilege and the things that we choose to leave out, recognizing our own blind spots in engaging in solidarity work. This is the hard work of what it means to be accountable to this question when you think about centering Indigenous politics and history in a country that works very hard to erase it consistently on a daily basis.
And it's not, this happens for those of you who do movement work in the room or who are watching the live stream. This happens a lot in movement spaces, but we call each other out and we're really harsh about how imperfect our politics are. And I myself have definitely participated in the call-out culture that's really prevalent in these spaces. But what we have been moving much more towards because of the casualties and the fracture that happens because of that particular behavior that we have towards one another is that the Red Nation has moved towards, and I think done a pretty good job of our phrase is we don't call out, we call in, calling relatives into the movement. And when you're calling somebody in, yes, you're expecting accountability, but there's a level of compassion. You treat each other like comrades, right? We don't engage in sort of the divisive behavior that happens a lot. And again, it's about meeting people where they're at and where they're coming from with their politics and understanding that we're all in really different places. We come from vastly different backgrounds, and it's a very imperfect, organic, messy process, but that's what the word struggle, that's what a materialist perspective of liberation looks like. And so we understand that that is our starting point, and we have a lot of generosity and a lot of compassion. And so, yeah, again, it's about community building, it's about accountability, but it's also treating each other with compassion. Treating each other like good relatives is actually what we say in the Red Nation. You need to be a good relative, and so what does that mean? And from that, that's the basis for how we relate to each other and how we relate to everybody.
I think that's it
Yeah.
from our part.
Thank you. No, what? No, please. We're all going to engage in a conversation, but I'm going to give you this mic actually because I just want to start us off on a conversation. So, yeah, and we're walking around. You know, I have to say, first of all, thank you both so much, and thanks for inviting me to be a part of the conversation. And so much of what you were talking about made me think about my time in working in one of our institutions, the US federal government and the US EPA, when I was head of international affairs and tribal affairs, and grappling with what it was like, grappling with the history of colonization of many of the US, of all of the US federal agencies, and being responsible for policy and you know, dealing with helping, as you call it, our relatives. You know, if I could call my colleagues, helping our relatives understand how we needed to engage the aspects of consultation that needed to be addressed, and to even bring up a conversation about colonization. It is it's a challenge. It's a huge challenge, but it's something that we all need to be doing in terms of our everyday lives. And it's something that I try and do as much as possible sitting at a university on Fifth Avenue. It's, you know, how many of us actually talk about these issues and engage in these issues? So I wanted to actually ask for you to tell us a little bit about some of our relatives in indigenous cultures. I mean, I don't think many of us know Lenape people, so we are on their territory. And if you could tell us a little bit about some of the work that you've been doing, Jas, with the Lenape people, who they are, you know, where they are, how, you know, what they might expect of us. If you could, Melanie, tell us more about you know, your people, the Dene people, and bring us more into a period of understanding. We don't have this opportunity often, and then I wanted to open it up because I'm sure the people have a lot of questions.
Start. Okay, go for it. I can start with the question about being accountable to Lenape people. So there's actually an undercited but incredible Indigenous feminist scholar named Joanne Barker who's Lenape. And I say she's undercited for reasons that baffle me because her work is amazing. She's actually one of the founders of kind of the new wave after the 2000s in Indigenous feminism. And she's done remarkable work on theorizing and historicizing Indigenous sovereignty and political claims to territory, like we were talking about during our presentation. She's done amazing work to sort of deconstruct the way that politics of tradition and culture and authenticity get worked into tribal nationalist governments, tribal governments that then come to define sort of the tribal nationalism that dictates the political imaginary of reservation spaces where we live, and the way that the politics of tradition and authenticity are deeply heteropatriarchal, they're deeply sexist, they're deeply homophobic, and how sort of the heteropatriarchal and the homophobic underpinnings of US nationalism get worked into how Native people police each other through these political imaginaries of tribal nationalism, which has actually been one of the major contributions of Indigenous feminism. And so I would recommend reading her work. Her name is Joanne Barker, Joanne Barker, Barker. She's at San Francisco State University. And yeah, she's one of the leading scholars in Native studies, I would say in the 20th and the 21st century. So read her.
And I would say, sort of just to follow up quickly on that in relationship to this question of Lenape land here in New York City, I've been working over the past 2 years with a couple of my comrades, Dean Saranillo at NYU, to develop a relationship with the Lenape Center. And so I am going to invite you all to come to a public event that we're hosting next semester in partnership with the Lenape Center. So we're currently developing the program. The whole conversation is going to be about understanding understanding New York City as Indigenous territory, talking about the histories of displacement, reading New York City as land through the Lenape perspective, through history and its people. So I think that's going to probably be the best public educative experience of understanding and thinking about New York City as Lenape territory that is being developed in partnership with the Lenape Center. And I think those are ways that we can be accountable, right? So when I was approached by the director of the Lenape Center to host an event at the New School that put these conversations at the center of the way we think about race and territory and New York City, we said yes, right? I said yes. We think about what it means to be in a university that is committed to public intellectualism and social justice, and that is accountable and responsive and attentive to the first peoples of this land. That's part of the way in which we do that work. So it's developing relationships with people in the community that can bring that political work to the university, and then it's pushing the university to make space for that kind of work to sit at the center of its intellectual and justice or social justice commitments. So that's what I'll say about the Lenape Center. So keep an eye out for the announcements around those events that are going to be happening early in the spring. I think end of February is when we're planning that.
And I'll just be real brief. I think asking me to talk about my people is a really complex topic because we're huge. 2010 census, there were about 300,000 of us. We live all over the world. We have a really large land base, but it's not as large as the land base that we had before colonization. I mean, our history of colonialism is harrowing. I mean, we were death marched to a concentration camp in the 1860s in what is now New Mexico, survived for 4 years. A lot of our people passed, but we were able to come back to the space where we now live, which is within our 4 sacred mountains, which defines sort of our customary territory, where all of our sort of our cultural, our political, and our legal traditions arise from that land and from that space. And so that's a really general overview. If you asked another Diné person to tell this, they would probably tell you something a bit different. Like I said, we're very diverse people. We have strong traditions of autonomy and how we speak about ourselves and our orientations to what it means to be a Diné person. There's a great deal of religious diversity to our people that's as diverse as our land base is large. And our histories of governance, there's a great deal of contestation about what governance and history and politics mean for our people. We have a vibrant tradition of grassroots resistance, particularly against resource extraction, but also against the incursion of the United States on any kind of authority or claim to authority that the US might have over our people. And so the tradition of resistance that comes from everyday people who are pushing back against sort of trying to put the US trying to put its boot down on us. Of course, we resist that because the history of Indigenous peoples is a history of resistance. We must resist in order to survive. And so this is very much strong in my own people. It's something I write about in my first book. That being said, our formal tribal government, which was founded in 1924, very much replicates normative notions of nationalism that underwrite US conceptions of nationalism. And so my dissertation advisor, Jennifer Nez-Denadale, who's the first Navajo person to ever get a PhD in history in 1999, it's pretty recent. I'm the first Navajo person she's ever worked with at the doctoral level in the academy. It's the first time that a Navajo feminist has ever worked with another Navajo feminist in the history of history, and in the academy. And so this tells you about how few of us there are in these spaces to be able to talk about these things and to do this work. But she has done incredible work because she's also a really important Indigenous feminist in unlocking the ways that Navajo nationalism replicates the homophobic and the heteropatriarchal underpinnings of US nationalism, and that the political traditions and the visions for Dene nationhood and the visions for belonging and or even our very conception of politics and governance that comes out of grassroots movements and grassroots political spaces is drastically, radically different than what comes out of the formal institutions of governance that in fact are controlled by the United States because of its legal relationship to not just our tribe, but to all Native people. And so something that's really important to understand, not just about my own people, but about Indigenous people, is that we don't all agree, right, about the terms of history, about basic questions of religion or politics or governance, and that there's as much struggle and contestation between us about what is ethical and what is right, how do we interpret history, as there is amongst any other kinds of people. And so this is just a really kind of glossed way of understanding my own people, the Dene. But for me, my allegiance lies with the everyday poor Dene people, my relatives who struggle every day just to survive. It doesn't lie with institutions of power. It doesn't lie with tribal governments who collude with the United States to extract uranium and coal and gas from our lands that then cause cancer rates in our people and destroy our land, which is our mother. It's actually our relative. It's not just something we live on, and actually destroys the water, which is also our relative. That I stand firmly with the people, the everyday people who suffer the consequences of that, and it's from my relationships. Within that struggle, the grassroots struggle, is from those relationships that my politics and my subjectivity emerges as a Dene person. And so yeah, that's how I would describe, in a nutshell, what it means to be Navajo. If you don't know where Navajo Nation is, look it up on a map. It's really big. You can't miss it.
Great. So we can open up for questions. Okay, sure. Go for it.
Okay, so you had your hand up first, and then you had your hand up second.
I think it's right here. First question.
It's right here.
Sorry.
The advantage of being in the front row.
Yeah. That's why I come to the front row. No. First, thank you. That was enlightening talk. I learned a lot, and I know it's not always easy to give a personal talk about issues that are personal to oneself. I know I have struggled doing it, so I can imagine, but you all did it with providing a great deal of information as well as dignity, so thank you for that. The question I'd like you to elaborate on what I think is the use of the word, use of multiculturalism, right? That struck me in the presentation, and I think that it seems to be parallel to how other peoples might be oppressed with the term multiculturalism. So I think in terms of Black people's struggles, somebody coined the phrase, I don't know who, multicultural liberalism. This notion that there's nothing unique about the experiences of oppression. A lot of people have oppression, all these identities. It almost kind of dilutes what race might mean by trying to talk about language of binding of grievances with that of all Americans, and then they go in and talk about everybody's struggle. What I heard you elaborate on was even another use of it, which was talking about multiculturalism in a way that, pun intended, we're going to whitewash your history. We're going to celebrate all the goodness that you bring to America without addressing some of the atrocities that were committed upon you. So the question is, can you elaborate even further about multiculturalism in general as ironically a tool of oppression?
So I feel like you just absolutely hit the nail on the head when you said this is sort of a liberal project. Multiculturalism is a project of liberalism. It's a project of the flattening of power, of a colonial history, of contemporary experiences of violence. It's a reframing of those through the celebration of difference. And it's a very powerful political project, right? Diversity and inclusion units are premised on multiculturalism. They're not premised on an analysis of colonial power, right? And so that is how everyone becomes inscripted into this project of celebration, into the recognition of difference without an accounting of colonial power or the social and political and economic conditions that have produced the situation that all of us are currently in, right? So it's depoliticization at its very core. So that's what I'll say about that. I don't know if it's on.
No, I think you just hit a slam dunk with your definition. I mean, it's a tactic of liberalism, more specific. It's become more common during the neoliberal period. And one of the ways that multiculturalism has functioned as a state project of liberalism, as a state project of incorporating difference through this mechanism of celebration, is to completely evacuate and depoliticize strident revolutionary movements of the kind that we saw in the 60s and the 70s. And so it really is a backlash and the state moving against and really trying to gut the really critical, right? The strident critiques of capitalism, understanding the truths of how the United States was founded, which was the basis of the Red Power movement, which was the basis of the Black Panther Party. It was the basis of radical feminism, right, during this time. And decolonization movements that were happening throughout the so-called Third World around that time too. And so it is a manifestation of liberalism, but it came into existence for a specific reason in a particular historical moment to squash what was actually a coalitional revolutionary movement that was building very strongly during that historical moment. And of course, when you flatten difference into celebration and you don't acknowledge the truths of history, you become incorporated into these institutional logics of diversity without actually challenging the structures of power, right, that govern our lives and create levels of hyper-disposability and hyper-violence against poor, racialized, and indigenous and queer bodies, basically, in the United States.
I just have one quick thing to add. I feel like Justin Trudeau's multicultural cabinet is the most current example of the celebration of multiculturalism and liberalism. So the sort of Kool-Aid drinking around, look at how diverse his multicultural cabinet is, which I feel like circulates so much in the U.S. imaginary about Canada as sort of a humanitarian nation with a better a better government, a government that is more attentive to Indigenous peoples, which I would say is absolutely false, is sort of the most contemporary manifestation in Indigenous North America.
Yeah, it's like multiculturalism is like, oh, we're going to deliver the same kind of biopolitical and racialized and colonial violence to you, but with like a kinder face. And we're going to expect you to participate in these logics of diversity and to manage yourself through the logic of inclusion and through the logic of multiculturalism so that you become the agent of your own oppression and the agent of your own demise, which is what the theory of biopolitics and governmentality describes. And there's a reason why Foucault wrote that as a theory of neoliberalism specifically. And so multiculturalism is one of the primary ways through which neoliberalism operates, and it's just it's bad news. It's bad news all around. It's bad news all around. It's just violence. It's just the same violence. So you had a question. Are you sure?
No, go ahead. Hi, so I just want to thank you both for providing this space and bringing us all into the conversation. My question is a little bit personal. I'm a student here at the new school, and the last couple of years I've really spent my time extracurricularly figuring out ways to provide space for students of color, specifically only for us, to come not with others, non-POC or non-student folks, to gather here on campus and really try and figure out what is coalition building. You know, we come together for different events. I mean, one part that's really important to us is sharing joy, but really under that, it's kind of what's being touched on here of marrying the experiences of the individual. We all go through these systems every day. Understanding that when we get to know one another personally, we will also get to know each other's struggles and better be able to understand how to go about fighting for all of us. And not in what you'd mentioned, sort of doing this oppression Olympics, but also not, erasing that there are different oppressions that affect different levels. And so could you speak to, you mentioned the term radical solidarity, and if you could just speak towards what is the difference? How can I, as an organizer, really try and push it over the edge so it's not just us sitting in a room looking at one another? That's not what we do. We do more than that, but.
So thanks for the question. This is something that we talk about all the time in the Red Nation, and we try to tackle all the time because the injury is real and the pain of biopolitical violence is real, even if the structure of power tells us that it's good for us, right? And so there is a great deal of violence that we're always dealing with, especially those of us who come from the populations that are disproportionately targeted by that violence. And so that being the case, how that often gets translated, and this is another facet of neoliberalism, or just liberalism in general, is into a narrative of individual healing, of individual catharsis, where the locus of change and transformation becomes our therapy on ourselves. And that's a tactic of liberalism as well. And so what we try to do in the Red Nation is we actually try to externalize that injury, and we turn it into a problem and a project that we work on together, so that we're not just suffering ourselves from the violence that we do actually experience and the violence that is real, but that we work on it together, and then that builds community, it builds accountability between us, and it allows us to have radical solidarity with one another that's not just about sitting around creating safe space to share our injury and to share our violence and then turn it into some sort of healing project, but instead to use that as the basis for really radical, strident organizing. And so this is something that it's not always perfect, the way that we do it in our space, but we're always trying to kind of move against the individualization of the site of transformation, and we're always trying to make it as collective as possible, because you can't build movements by like getting a massage, right? And I get massages all the time. Like, I love them, but that's not my movement work. You know, my movement work is holding radical space with lots of different people, many of whom I don't agree with, but going through that like messy, organic process of building struggle with others. And so we work with a lot of youth. When I was like 18, I was a hot mess. Like, I was so captivated by my own drama and like my own pain, because I came from a really difficult background, that it was super hard for me to externalize that and to just concentrate on the work itself. And so we're kind of always trying to work in that direction, but at the same time, like I said earlier, we've engaged in this entire Indigenous feminist practice of restorative justice that is about addressing the injury that we do to each other, because it's interpersonal, right? When you're feminist, the personal is political and the political is personal. But not allowing that to become just sort of something that gets cycled back into individual transformation, but instead tackling those problems at the same time that we're building struggle together, like having to balance those things is how we do it. And again, it's an organic process, so it's not like a linear progress narrative like US historians like to tell about history. It's dialectical. It's a very Marxist thing to think. But you go and struggle, you come out, you reflect, you go and struggle, you make a mistake, you have to be accountable, right? It's a very like messy, organic thing rather than like a progress narrative towards healing together. Because that's just a fallacy, I think. And what it also creates these goals that we never attain, and then it creates intense demoralization for people when you're trying to heal and you don't heal and you're always in struggle. And that also, I see a lot of people cycle out of the movement because they just get really burnt out because of that. So it also creates a false expectation, I think, when we think constantly about healing and sort of through this therapeutic narrative.
No, I'll just add something really quick, and that is that I feel like part of what you also do is that the struggle occurs around very material things, right? So when people are organizing on a campaign together, when they're working on a piece of writing, when they're reading a text together, there's a way to link like the individual experience with this externalization process that you're talking about. And I feel like that's what's so powerful about working with young people in the way that you do at the Red Nation, is that it's material in the sense that they're actually doing the political work around a series of things, as opposed to simply getting together every week and talking about it. I think that's also that, and so they're working things out as they're working on a campaign together, or organizing the protests, or participating in the entrada, and then thinking about everything that comes after that. So it's this again the kind of arsenal of resistance strategies that allow different entry points for people that are at different stages and are thinking about themselves differently in relationship to their political organizing and their movement work.
Theory and relationships come out of struggle. Theory isn't something that you impose on material struggle. You have to struggle together, and it's in the struggling together that you learn how to be a good comrade, that you learn a lot of things about yourself, and that you're transformed through the actual struggle. And like that's the theory of materialism that we espouse and we try to practice in the Red Nation, which I think Jas is describing. There's a lot of questions. Oh my God. So you had your hand up for a while. He did. Yeah.
Thank you. I guess my question actually builds off of the previous question and answer. But first of all, thank you for the lecture. It was very insightful, and it reminded me a little bit of the 1972 Oscars, where Marlon Brando refused his Academy Award due to how the film world had treated Native Americans in films as savages, and well, that was overall also a form of criminalization. I myself was born in 1997. That's 25 years later. That's a quarter of a century in Europe. And I also learned from cartoons like Lucky Luke, Donald Duck, and other TV shows that Indians, because that's how they were called, how they were portrayed, they are savages. They are wild, uncontrolled beings. And I started wondering, like, so Brando, did he have an impact at all? And then a couple of years back, another film was released, and again, this is 20. I forgot the title, but it was at 2010 or something. And again, Indians were portrayed as savages, and obviously, this is not only about the film world, but it's the bigger picture. I was just wondering, how, it sort of ties in with your question. How do we go about abolishing settler colonial? It's a big question, obviously, but how do we get the people outside of this room, the people who are not in our circle of relatives, out of their seats, out of their butts, and do something, you know?
So I think that your first question sounds like it's about like film industry, media industry, popular culture, and sort of how popular culture sort of feeds into particular representations of Indigenous people. And I would agree with you that for the most part, you see a mirroring back of the settler colonial project in mainstream media, in Hollywood, in depictions of Indigenous people, both historically and in the present, a kind of simplification, a flattening, or an entire erasure or projection into the past as sort of a bygone set of peoples. I do think that there is power in, and we know some amazing Indigenous filmmakers who are sort of challenging mainstream media and are really thinking critically about how to use that platform as another vehicle, similarly to all institutions, how you sort of infiltrate and sabotage from within those institutions. So we had, the privilege of having the Algonquin Métis filmmaker Michelle Latimer here last semester to screen her amazing, incredible films on Standing Rock, and there are many others that are doing this really important work. So I think that's one way in which, did Marlon Brando make a difference? I would I would say probably not that much of a difference. I mean, aside from raising a set of critical questions on one evening, but I do think there's a whole, cadre of people that are working to push that industry in really powerful and critical ways.
We have a lot of questions to go through really quickly. Something I think that's important to understand, again, kind of related to what I said about how when we think about healing as the side of our transformation and our political engagement as like a one-way street to healing, and all of a sudden not at some point in the future we'll be like totally liberated, and then this creates a great deal of discontent because we never reach that point. That instead, what's important to think about is not to get mired in sort of the sadness about things not being as effective as we want them to, and instead to understand history as a series of struggles back and forth. This is a very Marxist perspective of history as hegemony and counter-hegemony. And so when you see a lot of racism in the film industry or in the representational regimes about Native people that are constantly underwriting this imaginary of manifest destiny and then reinforcing settler colonialism and the erasure of Indigenous peoples, the way we change that history is we push back against it, we push back hard, and we mobilize. And there are people doing that around the Indigenous Peoples Day movement, which is also about the politics of representation and how that plays into naturalizing settler colonialism and kind of the popular imaginary of the US citizenship. There are people, like what we were doing with the Entrada protest was also about sort of this movement to unlock the real history of violence behind memorials, behind holidays, behind statues, behind our concept of history and the kinds of things that we celebrate. And there are actually a lot of people who are doing work against racism and anti-Indianism in the film industry. And so linking into the existing work that's being done and pushing it really hard, because you can actually make history by pushing back against history. Like, you actually make history by doing that. And so that helps me to think not really about something as a progress narrative, but rather as a series of struggles. And it's through the struggle that not just new materialities are created, but also new dreams and imaginaries are created. And it's a constant back and forth process. So long as capitalism and colonialism rule the day, it will be a constant back and forth process. And it's our job to push back.
Well, first, I really do want to say thank you for not just your analysis, but your candor around the ways that those analyses interact with who you are as, human beings on the planet. And so my question is similar to something that was asked earlier, specifically around call-in versus call-out culture, right? And so often we see what you touched on a little bit earlier, systems of heterosexuality and patriarchy and cis-centeredness and capitalism being replicated in movement spaces, and so much of the feminist way of organizing is a reimagining or coming to understand ways that we can move and exist outside of those spaces. But it's exhausting to sort of constantly be reimagining and constantly be fighting. It feels like on two sides, right? To be fighting in your movement building space about like, hey, it's problematic for you to be transphobic, and also to be like fighting in the not movement space of like, white supremacy is bad. So how or what are ways or strategies that you have for maintaining this culture of saying like in our space we must keep each other safe? Because if we don't keep each other safe, who's going to do it?
Okay, cool. Yeah.
Oh, is it my turn? Yeah. Oh, right. Thank you so much for being here. My question is, I saw on the internet the other day this definition of moving out, and it reads, when the European settlers arrived, they needed land to live on. The First Nations people agreed to move to different areas to make room for the new settlements. I know, it's so funny. And so the book is on recall because false. And it's a Canadian textbook, but I feel like that same language is used throughout history books. And I wanted to know, so some of the arguments were, it's a third grade textbook, and some of the arguments were, well, how would you even teach that to a third grader? And so I'm sitting in this room and I'm listening to you speak and I'm thinking, a third grader could not sit in this, I mean, maybe, I don't know, but I don't think a third grader could sit in this room and realistically understand what's going on. And I wanted to know what language I could use for my younger cousins to be like, well, this is really what history is, and I don't want it to be sanitized, but I also don't want it to be scary, but I want to make sure that they know what the truth is without all the extra verbiage.
Okay, I'll take the first, and Jas will take the second, if that's good. So your question was, what are some useful tactics or methods of making sure that we hold safe and radical space, that we're accountable to each other with the politics that we have, at the same time that we're also combating the world in which we live, which is a white supremacist, heteropatriarchal, colonial world, right? Right, so we struggle with this all the time in the Red Nation as well. And I think for us, what is really important is that we have a 10-point program. It's the basis of everything that we do, and it's really clear. We're really clear. If you want to roll with the Red Nation, if you want to organize with us, you better damn well be a feminist. And if you're not at that place yet, then we welcome you into the circle, but with the expectation that there will be a level of accountability to what it means to be a feminist. And so it's holding a really strong political line at the same time that we engage in political education with our comrades. And so it's not always an easy dance to play because, like I said, we do deal with transphobia in the work. We do, we do deal with people who are at really different levels and at really different places with their intersectionalism, honestly, their intersectionality and their ability to think about different kinds of oppression, different structures of power in relationship to one another. And so we're always engaging in political education. We do this partly through collective reading groups and through talking circles and conversations. We have a system of restorative justice. There's a lot of stuff written on restorative justice if you don't know what that is, but maybe you can look up some of that. There's material readily available on how you implement restorative justice as sort of a conflict resolution approach within the dynamic of the movement or the organization or the group that you work with that holds people accountable, but it also doesn't completely ostracize them and evacuate, right, your group of the actual people who you need in order to organize effectively. And so it's kind of like a double dance when you're trying to hold people accountable and you have really hardline politics, but at the same time you're trying to be a generous and approach people where they're coming from. And we can talk a bit more about that. I know that's a super general thing, but we're almost out of time.
The 10-point program.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
It's our 10-point program.
So on the question of how to do the education with young people, like really young people, I can speak to this from the vantage point of a mother of 2 kids who were raised in a very politicized household from a very young age. And a couple of things I'll say about this is that this work is ongoing. The kind of pervasive colonial representations of both Black people, Native people, immigrants, migrants, that is rampant throughout the education system, the media system. I mean, I could not believe, I raised my kids without a television, and this sort of politicized children's books, of which if you search, you'll find a bank of them. There's some really good collections of children's book now that begin to do this work of restoring the United States and Canada. But this is an everyday project. So my kids would get one story at home, then they'd go to school and get another story, and then they'd come home saying things that were representative of sort of dominant representations of Indigenous people, of Black people. And so we would constantly be in conversations about this until they were old enough that they had developed this kind of critical way of thinking about everything that they heard around them, right? Which made them not the most popular students in the class sometimes with their teachers. But I think it is a kind of ongoing project. A piece of, it's part of a political responsibility and accountability when you're living on land that is stolen, occupied territory, when you're living in an environment where there is so much violence against people, Black people, the history of slavery, the Atlantic slave trade. There's a lot there, but there are ways to translate this history. I think people become afraid of traumatizing their kids, right? So this is often what I would hear from other parents, like, you tell your kids those stories, aren't they traumatized? And my response would always be, this is a kind of accountability and responsibility that I have as a parent, because I'm raising 2 other people to be human beings. And unless I want them to take up the colonial project, you have to do this kind of educative work. It's part of the work of, it's also a feminist practice, right? It's sort of, I can't have these politics in the academy and my organizing work and not have them at my dinner table. They sort of go hand in hand. So I would encourage you to do some of that Google searching and find those books, because there are some really incredible children's books now that push back against these narratives in profound ways, but it's an ongoing project, an everyday project of re-education.
So we're going to get ready to close, but I have one last question, and then a thank you, and then a request. The last question is, what can we do at New School to be good relatives? I want specifics, please.
Oh, I can answer from the start.
I don't know enough about politics at the New School, but the reason why I just kind of gave my little hug for that is the way that you frame that question, like, is so radical. What can we do to be good relatives at the new school? Like, that's such an Indigenous thing to say. And that is like the impetus for the no ban on stolen land intervention into what was happening in the movement at that time in January. It was like, how do we enact a politics of relationality and accountability to each other that doesn't reproduce sort of this naturalized notion of manifest destiny, right? And so I think framing it in that way and asking questions in that way is an amazing step in that direction, because you know, for Diné people, for us, I mean, we incorporate new clans, and we used to have, our original clans were 4, we have now over 100, right? And it's because we have a really capacious, thriving understanding of who we are as a people, and it's about making new relatives all the time, and about being good relatives to each other in the process of making new relatives in these ever-growing sort of circles of relatives. And so that's all I'll say about that. Jas might know like specific strategies since you work at the institution.
I mean, I would say hire Indigenous faculty. There's currently, you know, like, we don't have a very strong critical Indigenous studies program at the university, nor is it well represented in most of the departments that teach about colonialism and history. So I think supporting public programming, I think the tricky part here is to not just do sort of additive, tokenistic kinds of change, but bringing about real structural change requires a commitment to this kind of politics. And that means a transformation in the material structure of the institution itself. So these are questions about hiring, they're questions about recruitment of Native students, they're about the kind of support you're gonna offer Native students when they come here, they're about coalition building with students like Hunter and her comrades who are sitting here and are thinking about these questions in really critical ways. The students are often ahead of what we think about in the canon and the curriculum. It's also like seriously challenging the canon. What do we teach in the social science and the history departments? Who are we hiring? How do we, and again, this would be sort of a critique of the kind of tokenistic diversity models that are often used in institutions of higher education to begin to bridge these kinds of critiques, right? So when institutions of higher education come under fire, there's sort of a laundry list of 5 or 6 things that are done in order to be able to address. These are fundamental structural changes that are required. And that requires time and energy. And I mean, and I know we're sort of working on this together, so it's moving in the right direction, and Mary's here too. And so I think that this kind of attention and bringing sort of supporting a decolonial agenda, an agenda of pushing against the historical violence and contemporary violence of the academy, has to be part of what the new school does.
So I want to thank our own scholar, Professor Jaskiran Dhillon, for bringing us to this space, for always bringing us to this space. It's not just tonight, but you have been bringing us to this space for as long as I've known you. So I want to thank you very much for this evening and many, many, many other days and evenings and weekends and all of the work that you've put into this and your scholarship. And thank you to Professor Melanie Yazzie for coming a long way to be with us, to be able to educate us, to be able to bring us to not only an intellectual space, but a personal space. Thank you for your partner for coming as well. Absolutely. How did you? Yes, yes. And you know, you gotta love an incredible intellectual, incredible scholar who is also an incredible organizer. So in the organizing tradition that goes along with scholarship, I have a request of all of you. As you are all sitting down for dinner on Thursday, as I know most of you will, please remember this lecture. Please remember the learnings. Please bring it into your conversation as you all are sitting down and just naturally it rolls off your tongue, Happy Thanksgiving. Please take that moment to be able to discuss what that day, what our history, what our present is really about. Thank you. See you next week.